So our next story is uh we're gonna watch a little interview between Neil deGrasse Tyson and Ben Shapiro, and then we're gonna talk about it.
Seems like the left is militating against the advent of science. One of those areas is the area of transgenderism. The argument that is typically made by gender theorists is that gender is entirely separate from sex. You've seen the argument made that it makes no difference on average if men are stronger than women are, and that if we were to allow transgender women to compete with non-transgender women, then this would somehow not disadvantage biological women. And this seems to me absolutely ascientific, that if we're actually going to have a discussion about gender and sex, that should be based in data, which suggests that mammals are in fact binary in terms of their sex, unless you have intersex birth defects typically, or genetic defects.
I'm happy to opine on this. This only matters because today we segregate nearly all sports by gender. Otherwise, why do we even give a shit? what someone identifies with? We live in a free country, and with consenting adults and people free expression of who and what they are.
I mean, on an adult level, I agree with you. I think it doesn't matter what you teach
That's what I'm
children.
saying. And so there's the matrix of what you are biologically, how you express yourself, who you choose as a sexual partner. If we actually live in a free country, as we tell ourselves, people's freedom to behave in any of those ways should not concern you at all. Nor are they requiring that you behave that way. Okay?
Well,
this is for their own freedoms, because we live in a free country. Now, what is unresolved here is, what do you do with sports? It's unresolved. And I follow that closely, and I don't see any meaningful solutions that come down off of that. We know that hormones manifest differently in different people, and there's the whole thing with steroids. Steroids are hormones, right? And we rallied against steroids in professional sports because it gives you an undue advantage. So I've tried to think of what the future of sports would be in the world of a gender spectrum. And it may be you don't specify whether it's a male or female sport. You just take measurements of what your hormonal balances are. And so you compete based on your hormones. I mean, this is thought I had. I don't know. I don't know where it's going to land.
The WNBA won't be in business for very long if that's the case.
It would just be you'd have to find some way to compete people against each other if you still care that sports is an interesting activity.
I guess the area where it does come up in a non-sports area.
Yeah, tell me. I don't know.
So it would be, you talk in your book about the education of children and teaching children about science. And right now, children are being taught about the quote-unquote gender spectrum, which is not scientifically based. That is a theory-based idea.
No, wait, hold on. People express themselves on a spectrum. So you learn that.
That's a social point, not a scientific point.
It's
meaning we express ourselves
hold on.
based in different languages. Is that something you teach in science class, or is that something that you teach when you're teaching language?
So whether the fact that people want to express themselves on a spectrum, on a gender spectrum, whether that fact is something you want to put in a sociology class or in a science class, maybe that remains to be determined. But it is a real fact about real society.
Well, of course, nobody's denying that people identify how they want to identify.
So
the question is, what is the relationship of that to biology? Meaning that the argument is made that trans women are women, for example. And what that seems to mean is that trans women are identical to women. Now, if people want to say trans women are not biological women, obviously that is the case. But people don't seem to want to say that, although that is obviously scientifically true. Trans women are not biological women. Biological women are biological women.
But where are you going with this? What are you trying to accomplish by asking yourself, is it science or is it not science? It's people in society.
But this is a perfect example of an area where suddenly it doesn't matter to say things that are just true. Like, why is it bad or wrong to point out?
I have another way to approach this. I care what is objectively true in the world as a scientist. But let me not say even as a scientist. I just simply care what is objectively true. And science happens to be a pretty potent path to invoke, to find out what is true. And so if people express themselves on a gender spectrum, and that is an actual thing in an actual society, if we have not fully explained that scientifically, that's an interesting frontier to study. If you want to say it's only sociological, then it's the purview of the social sciences. I don't care who studies it. It's an interesting fact about society that's worth learning about. To fight someone and say, it's not biological, it's just your this, it's real and it's there.
Well,
because it's real because it manifests.
But it is real because it manifests. But the question of the of how to classify manifest.
Okay, so there's a lot of like really interesting stuff. Ben Shapiro, he has horrible takes on everything. And so Neil deGrasse Tyson has some amazing counterpoints to his attacks, his gotchas, and I really like it. I really like it. So we're kind of going to start from the top. We'll actually start a little bit before this. Now, it doesn't have it in this video, but before this, they were talking about climate change. And they were talking about, Ben Shapiro said something along the lines of, well, it's not something that the right wing cares so much about. So let's move on to something that the right wing does care about, which is LGBTQ rights and trans people and trans people in sports and using the same and is that so over? If that's the priorities of the Conservative Party, wow, do you guys gotta get your stuff together? If transgender people in sports is a more important issue than climate change, than disasters all over the world, than record high heat throughout the country, you guys seriously need to reevaluate what's going on. So I want that to be my first point. And then, he goes into, talk about transgender science and transgender people in sports. Now, one thing I will disagree with Neil deGrasse Tyson is like, this conversation isn't just based on, even if it is slightly how Ben Shapiro frames it, these discussions are never just based on something as simple as what gender or what sports team and what gender, all sports teams could be co-ed for all I care. That's not the real issue, no matter how you frame it. Real issue is, are you going to give these people the right to express themselves? And really, Neil deGrasse Tyson hits it on the head. Is we are arguing about people's right to express themselves how they would like, whether it's science or nature or nurture. Now, in my opinion, I believe it's probably a little both, but I do believe mostly that it's nurture. It's how, or it's how you, not like when you're young, how you're affected by certain things. I don't think anyone is particularly born gay or straight, but I think at a very young age, these ideas are molded into your head, even if you don't fully grasp what they are. Maybe it's by outside circumstances, maybe by it's internal, but no matter that's why we need to study them, because it is it because there's so many questions that are up in the air about sexuality, about transgenderism. There's just so many things up in the air. What's not up in the air is the fact that when you're not allowed to express yourself the way you like, the way you feel is natural to you, cases of drug addiction rise, cases of suicide rise, depression, anxiety. It's really bad for your mental health if you cannot act on what your brain is calling you to do. You should be able to act however you want to act. You should be able to live however you want to live. And I don't know if Ben Shapiro just doesn't understand that, or I think he wants to attack what he doesn't understand. And he's afraid of it because he doesn't get it. Ben, some things aren't it's not your fight. They're not yours to get. They're not yours to own. They're not yours to have collected in a tiny little box. They're just not. But we need to study them, and that's the most important reason to study them, is because if you have questions, that's what science exists for. What science, again, what science are we going to put it under? Like natural science, social sciences, like that's a good question. But it needs to be studied and looked at because it is very interesting. And I'll tell you the main reason why it's interesting, and it's I know people like Ben Shapiro like to claim that, oh, it's because of the culture that transgenderism is such a thing, and because of Tumblr and such. But if you go back in history, transgenderism has basically existed since people have been around, just like homosexuality. And honestly, the same as being gay. I feel the same as being a minority. Being transgender, if you could choose not to be and be completely comfortable with yourself, why wouldn't you? Nobody wants to make themselves more of an outlier. Nobody wants to alienate themselves. We already feel, as a collective body of people, I feel like we already feel so isolated from one another, like we can't really connect. And I don't feel like anybody wants to really make ourselves feel more like that on a day-to-day basis. I wouldn't, but I am who I am, and sometimes I have to alienate myself because it's just the way I am. So it's a really deep issue, which Ben Shapiro is wrong about. We need to be studying this. We need to get. We may never get to the root of these issues, but we definitely need to study them, and I like to study them myself because it's interesting to me.